So let's move on to the ICJ hearings, which started this morning. So let me explain a little bit of how this is going to work and a little bit of the context and backstory here. In fact, if we can put up the Reuters tear sheet first here, guys, that gives some of the context, and then I'll get to a little bit of playing some of the sound from the hearing. So this is via Haaretz. Reuters reports that South Africa and Israel are exchanging allegations on the eve of hearings at the UN's top court, which will hear South Africa's claim that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza war. They're going to hold sessions on Thursday and Friday in a case brought in late December accusing Israel of failing to uphold its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention. Okay, on the South African side, they are saying, as a people who once tasted the bitter fruits of dispossession, discrimination, racism, and state-sponsored violence, we are clear that we will stand on the right side of history. An Israeli government spokesperson responded that the state of Israel will appear before the ICJ to dispel South Africa's absurd blood libel as Pretoria gives political and legal cover to the Hamas rapist regime. There will be a panel of 17 judges, including South Africa and Israel can both appoint one judge themselves. Those are called ad hoc justices. And each judge represents a different nation. Actually, the U.S. judge is sort of leading the proceedings. And a ruling on the provisional measures could be expected later this month. So what they're arguing right now is not the merits of the case. They're trying to meet a legal standard of it is plausible that genocide is being committed here, that it's plausible. And South Africa is pushing for effectively an injunction where the ICJ would order Israel to cease all activities that are furthering the harm of the Palestinian people. Now, Israel is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. The U.S. is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. And although our complicity here won't be a center of these hearings, there are clear follow-on ramifications for us since we are the ones supplying Israel with these bombs. So we are not an uninvolved party here. This morning, you had South Africa presenting their side of the case. I did a breakdown over the weekend of the 84-page filing that they had submitted to the court, giving their analysis of both the actions that are being taken that they say are consistent with violation of the Genocide Convention, as well as statements from various ministers, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, various defense ministers as well, and soldiers, rank-and-file soldiers on the ground that they say demonstrate genocidal intent as well. So that's sort of the backstory here. This morning, we got to hear South Africa's case that they are making for this injunction. Let's take a listen to a little bit of that.
In the first 3 weeks alone, following 7 October, Israel deployed 6,000 bombs per week. At least 200 times, it has deployed 2,000-pound bombs in southern areas of Palestine designated as safe. These bombs have also decimated the north, including refugee camps. 2,000-pound bombs are some of the biggest and most destructive bombs available. They are dropped by lethal fighter jets that are used to strike targets on the ground by one of the world's most resourced armies. Israel has killed an unparalleled and unprecedented number of civilians, with the full knowledge of how many civilian lives each bomb will take.
So Saagar, I actually watched these hearings this morning. They had, South Africa had a number of different individuals making the case. Israel will make their case in defense of these allegations tomorrow. So I'll make sure to tune into that as well so we can break that down for you too. Many of the numbers, statistics, the facts about the percentage of the killings that are women and children, the amount of destruction, the imposition of a siege, which has led to hunger, starvation, conditions, and also the lack of medical supplies, the complete collapse of the healthcare system. We've covered a lot of this extensively on the show, so you'll be familiar with a lot of the arguments that are laid out here. They also spent quite a bit of time talking about the various statements that, as I mentioned before, they claim establish intent. They spent in particular a lot of time on comments that we played at the beginning of the war when Netanyahu himself compared the Palestinians to Amalek, biblical foes of Israel, who they are charged with destroying in their entirety, including the camel, including the oxen, including the suckling, et cetera, et cetera. And then they showed how soldiers on the ground took these comments seriously. And we are told that part of Israel's defense will be, oh, these comments, people are just popping off. They don't really mean it. This is just populist rhetoric that doesn't really mean, they don't really mean what they're saying. And yet they showed soldiers who are on the ground repeating the words of Netanyahu and then using that justification to enact and celebrate war crimes that they're committing there on the ground. So I thought that connection was sort of novel and something that, a case that I hadn't seen fully fleshed out before.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading through, so the Article 2 of the convention, I know you went through this, but Article 2, Part C is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The biggest problem they have is actually a lot of this is really fascinating to think, because so many turning points happened from October 7th prior to the actual invasion. And the implication of putting on that siege of all of Gaza and eventually then bargaining about right of return for people in exchange for hostages, that seems to me like the biggest problem that they're going to have. We should also, though, be honest here in terms of what the ICJ and all of that implication is. They have no enforcement mechanism. So this is the bigger problem with the entire United Nations. It's like I was reading that in 2004, the ICJ said that the fence between Gaza and Israel needs to be taken down. Okay, well, it's still up. Nobody can do anything about that. To a certain extent, the UN and international law and all that other stuff is fake because it all comes down to the enforcement. But on another extent, in a rules-based technical international order, at least allegedly, what matters more is becoming a pariah state and losing your overall trading relationships. And this is something you and I were talking about a little bit before. But if you do look at the largest top 15 trade partners of Israel, number 1 is the United States, but number 2 is Germany. Number 5 or whatever is France. A huge number of G7 nations in there.
Yeah.
And the rest of the G7, they're very much more likely to take something like this seriously, specifically because if you think about it, the European Union and many of these other European countries are much more subject to respecting multilateralism, international institutions than the U.S. is. So they may not lose their number 1, but if they, let's say, have a 40% reduction in trade, or maybe 30% or whatever, that's still devastating to the overall economy, not to mention visa rights. Israeli citizens are all over the world. I mean, what if they're not able to travel? Freedom of, moving about and all that. That's massive implications. It's an underrated part of being an American is you can mostly just land in whatever country you want.
Yeah.
But if you're Israeli, I mean, that could be a big problem for you.
Yeah.
Ask a Russian, what it's like to fly through Istanbul.
That's exactly
today.
right.
I think that's the biggest problem of this. Well, you can say whatever, Yugoslavia. I mean, it took forever or even try and bring those people to justice, and their country didn't even exist anymore. Or if we think about Rwanda or some of the other fallouts from there, Israel is a powerful nation. They have the sponsorship of the global superpower. They won't face any real, quote unquote, actual consequences, even if they were to be found guilty. But in the soft power realm, I certainly think this could be a good problem for them.
My initial reaction when I saw South Africa's filing was like, okay, that's nice, but it's not going to matter at all.
Yeah.
Right? Because, I mean, we see the U.S. and our allies, we operate with impunity. We make the rules. We ignore them when it's convenient. We try to weaponize them when it's convenient, when it's against our adversaries. We see the way that this plays out. And nowhere is that more the case than with Israel, as you're pointing out, historically for many years at this point. What sort of changed my thinking about this could have some bite was the Israeli reaction.
Yeah.
Because they started putting out these sort of panicked missives, urgent cables to their embassies around the world, trying to get countries to come on board and issue these statements very similar to the statements our government was making about how this is meritless and it's anti-Semitic and et cetera, et cetera. So that showed me that they were concerned about it. The fact that they're even going to defend themselves shows a measure of seriousness about it. And then you think about it, okay, well, what do they have to lose? As you said, Saagar, I mean, France has already said they're going to abide by whatever the ruling is here. Right. So, we're kind of on an island in terms of our willingness to just flagrantly disregard what the ICJ rules. And even with us, we have laws on the books like the Leahy Act that are designed to prevent U.S. weapons from going to massacre civilians. And so even though our State Department is saying like, oh, we're not going to look into whether there are any war crimes here, but we don't think there are, and we're just going to continue business as usual. Actually, we're going to expedite these weapon shipments. It gives those who are dissenting voices a tool to use to try to compel and try to pressure the U.S. government, Joe Biden himself, and to force a different direction. So it gives U.S. dissidents a tool to use. And, Israel is a global nation. It is, very proud of its high-tech sector. It is very reliant and very covetous of foreign direct investment. This has been an incredibly important part of building Israel into a truly, first world developed economy. And so for them to face the prospect of becoming like South Africa was in the waning days of apartheid, this sort of pariah nation where no longer, this is what they said in Haaretz, in an op-ed in Haaretz, listen, no longer are people talking about us as occupiers. They're talking about us as genocide, with the words ethnic cleansing, with the words genocide. Like, this is a very different deal. So those things have apparently impressed the Israelis as being serious and being significant. We can put up on the screen, this actually list has changed, the number of countries that are supporting South Africa's case here. This number rose overnight, but as of yesterday, you had Malaysia, Turkey, Jordan, Bolivia, Venezuela, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Maldives, Namibia, Nicaragua. You had Brazil join overnight, and significantly, you had the Arab League, which includes Saudi Arabia, very noteworthy here, joining on to this case. So I believe there are 13 countries individually signing on to the case. And then you have the Arab League, and there's another Islamic country association that includes 57 different nations that have signed on as well. And apparently, Saagar, the reason they do it that way is to try to avoid the greatest opprobrium from the United States of America. But think about Saudi. I mean, Israel and Saudi have been the bedrock of our Middle Eastern policy forever. And obviously we, have this tight-knit relationship with the Saudis. We give them tons of money as well. They were this close to normalizing relations with Israel before October 7th, and now they're signing on to a case of genocide against Israel at the ICJ. That is a dramatic turn of events.
The two most important ones that are listed, number one is actually Turkey. Turkey is one of their largest trading partners. Netanyahu and Bibi used to actually have a decent relationship, and they are a member of NATO. That's why that one matters. I would actually say that's probably the most important. Saudi Arabia and the Arab League is going to be number two. The reason why is that currently the U.S. plan for bringing an end to the war is to have Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel officially as a continuation of the Abraham Accords, and then also include some sort of language about a two-state solution. So you can't really say that you're going to normalize relations with somebody if you say they're also committing genocide. So that's going to be a little bit of a difficulty. I think a problem. Demonstrates also some of the Gordian knot I think that these people are in. And to underscore that, I also agree, and before we're about to play this, it's Bibi basically walking back some of the things that have been said in Israeli society. Is something that occurred to me when you were talking is, Israel doesn't even have to become a pariah state. I have to be sensitive in the way I talk about this, but let's be honest. The worst thing for Israel is for them to be a normal state. What have they always been? They've been the home of the Jews post the genocide by the Nazi regime, which has imbued them, I think, let's all be honest, with special status in the way that we were talked about in the United States. Very, very difficult, conflation of saying anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. And one of the things that they often reach for is they're like, well, our ancestors were killed by the Nazis, which has imbued them kind of with a special character where they've been able to brush off criticism, I think, for some 70-part year of their history. I know this is very sensitive, but I think, we have to be real about the way that they've been able to have that, the imbue around them of the post-Nazi era was such that it gave them almost like a moral standing. If they're just elevated to what I've always wanted to treat Israel as, which is any other country, pluses and minuses of our relationship with anybody else, well, I think that's the biggest problem.
Yeah.
Is that if they're just bumped down from special status to normal status, well, that's actually a big change, in their global position for a long time. And as you said, their economy, it's not America. They've got big problems. They're surrounded on all sides. High-tech sector is great, but you got to sell it to somebody. And you can sell it to America, but America's not the whole world. You got to import a lot of oil. You have, obviously, you've got surrounded by the Red Sea. They've had hostile partners for quite some time, but they roughly were able to reach some sort of middle ground. I think they threw a lot of that away, and they don't really think about what does Israeli society look like in 25 years?
Yeah.
I think that is a fundamentally different question post-October 7th.
Yeah.
Which is a problem for them. But let's play a little bit of what Bibi Netanyahu said yesterday. Keep this in mind, in English, tweeted out by the Israel account. Clearly, this is targeted to America and to the world. Here's what he had to say.
I want to make a few points absolutely clear. Israel has no intention of permanently occupying Gaza or displacing its civilian population. Israel is fighting Hamas terrorists, not the Palestinian population. And we are doing so in full compliance with international law. The IDF is doing its utmost to minimize civilian casualties, while Hamas is doing its utmost to maximize them by using Palestinian civilians as human shields. The IDF urges Palestinian civilians to leave war zones by disseminating leaflets, making phone calls, providing safe passage corridors, while Hamas prevents Palestinians from leaving at gunpoint, and often with gunfire. Our goal is to rid Gaza of Hamas terrorists and free our hostages. Once this is achieved, Gaza can be demilitarized and de-radicalized, thereby creating a possibility for a better future for Israel and Palestinians alike.
Pretty shocking, actually, to hear that in English. I mean, it actually hasn't said that in a long time. We went back and looked. And I don't think it's a coincidence necessarily, Krystal, that it does come the day before the beginning of these genocide proceedings. But I also think a huge part of this is American domestic politics, is that Biden, apparently behind the scenes, what I was reading yesterday, is that Blinken went there and Jake Sullivan and others with a message to Ben-Gvir and others like, you guys got to cut this out. Like, if you guys keep saying this stuff, and especially putting out these tweets and all that, screwing us in English, what are we supposed to do? I mean, you're causing big problems for us back in America because everybody knows how to use Google Translate and everybody can read. So this was a message. Effectively, what is he? He's I wouldn't say he's disavowing per se, because he's the master of saying things in English and saying very different things in Hebrew. But it's different. He hasn't said it before. It hasn't really been something that he said since around October 15th. And the reason why is because he has such immense pressure from his right flank. Ironically, this type of statement, which probably is better off for Israel in the long run in terms of their international standing, makes his domestic political situation much more precarious.
Yes.
I don't know, though, if Ben-Gvir and if these others, or Smotrich, would be willing to force him out, specifically for then disavowing their stated desire to reoccupy it and settle Gaza.
Yeah. It's very hard to say. I suppose that we don't know what he's telling them behind the scenes.
Right.
Like, listen, I got to tell the
I gotta
Americans
say this.
I mean, he famously was caught on a hot mic a while ago, like, I know how to handle the Americans.
Yes.
Don't worry about it. So
it's true.
In contrast to these statements, we have a raft of reporting about how he wants to, quote, thin out the population of Gaza, about how the preferred outcome is to push them out into the Sinai Desert, about how they want to pressure the U.S. to leverage our aid dollars to regional countries to pressure them into accepting refugees. We have reporting that they have been in active talks with the government of Congo about accepting refugees. So the reporting that exists and the statements not just of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, but other Likud party members, other ministers in his own government, are directly at odds with these comments. So I would not take them all that seriously in terms of their content. I think the timing of them that you're pointing to, Saagar, is what's so significant here. Both that you had the U.S. Political class so humiliated and embarrassed by the fact that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich were just so brazen in what they're saying and repeatedly saying it, making incredibly clear that ethnic cleansing is their goal, that they even felt the need to put out this statement of like, listen, that's not, we don't support that. But also that's not the stated, that's not the policy of the Israeli government. Well, there was no evidence that that wasn't the policy of the Israeli government. So perhaps the Israelis were pressured by Blinken or Biden, who actually hasn't talked to Netanyahu apparently in 20 days, but by Blinken and others to put out some sort of ass-covering statement. And then I do think the fact that this comes the day before the ICJ trial commences is no accident. I mean, this is almost like cramming for the test the night before. And you saw some other comments like this coming out from Israeli government officials trying us. War crimes? Of course not. Of course we're not at war with the Palestinian civilians. Very different from the seed of Amalek. These are human animals and they'll be treated as such. We want Nakba 2023. Very different from the sort of comments that we have heard throughout this conflict, which again, I think shows that while the ICJ doesn't have any enforcement mechanism, apparently Israel is at least somewhat concerned with what they may rule in this case. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.